Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I am so excited to be here. We have a great webinar today with some rock stars in the DevOps space, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for any of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use the question and answer tab on your interface and submit your question. And we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have 3 polling questions during today's webinar, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged with those. And we also have a very interactive chat tab on the interface, and I'll be monitoring it on the front end, and I'm sure our speakers will also take a look at it every once in a while. But we encourage you to send us your questions, comments, suggestions, whatever you want to share with us. It would be great, and we'll be more than happy to chat you back and maybe even get your comments integrated into the webinar. Finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you will be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Fireside Chat, a team-centric view of security. As I said before, we've got 3 rock stars in the house today on today's webinar. We're going to start off with Patrick Debois, who is probably best known for co-authoring the DevOps Handbook, coining the term DevOps in 2009, and founding the DevOps Days events. So currently, he is a Labs Researcher and the Director of DevOps Relations and Market Strategy at Snyk. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, great. Well, next up, we have Anders Wallgren, who is the VP of Technology Strategy at CloudBees, and certainly no stranger to DevOps.com. Anders brings with him more than 30 years of in-depth experience designing and building commercial software. And Anders, I hope that does not make you feel too old by me saying that. But thank you very much for joining us today. Really do appreciate it. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Yeah, great to see everyone as well.
All right, great. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Ravi Mara, who is, what is your title, Ravi? I don't have it here in front of me. Head of Product and Partner Marketing at Snyk. I apologize for that. But we've got, you are going to actually be the moderator for the conversation. And I know you have worked with companies such as Akamai to build and promote their products, brand, and customer successes. So great stuff all the way around. And I know you guys have a I'm just so, like I said, I'm so excited about having all 3 of you here and getting the discussion rocking and rolling. So I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and I'll let you guys just dive right on into it.
Terrific. Thanks, Charlene. I'll jump in as I'm moderating the session. I do want to correct one thing. We have 2 DevOps rock stars, and then we have me on this call. We have the guy who invented the term DevOps, and we have a guy with 30 years experience as a technology strategist in DevOps. And that's who you really want to hear from today. So my goal is just going to be to ask the questions that I think are on all of your mind, the fact that you showed up at this webinar with this title, and let these 2 help us understand how we can achieve a team-centric view of security. So just as an introduction, what is this topic about? What are we trying to solve for? DevOps is being more widely adopted today, and that has helped reduce the friction between development and operations that existed. It hasn't completely eliminated it, but it's done a lot to reduce that friction. And now companies and organizations want to try to say, well, how do we take the next step and include security in that and expand from DevOps to DevSecOps? And whether you are someone who passionately believes we should use the word DevSecOps, or whether you passionately believe we should just call it DevOps and security should be a part of it, we're not going to debate that today. We're going to agree that we want to build security into the process. And what can we do to do that effectively? We know that with DevOps, we created this shared culture, culture of shared ownership We build it, we run it, and that has resulted in faster development and better operational outcomes. But security, for the most part, has not come along for the ride in that. And so that's what we're looking to solve for. We want to build security into the DevOps process so we can build it faster, operate it better, and have it be more secure as we go forward. And like I said, we've got two rock stars here today who have a lot of good ideas to share with us as we all try to plan how we do this. So I'm going to jump right into the first question around this, which is when you look at what's happened with DevOps, but also what's happening in application security in general, what's new in application security? What's driving a new approach to application security? And Anders, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll just get conversational and have a chat.
Yeah, great. So I think, what we've seen in the last few years, and which will continue to be the case, obviously, is focusing a lot on the security of our applications, on our code, on the libraries, open source, commercial frameworks, and so on that we use. And I think what we're seeing a little bit more of ourselves with our customers is an increased focus on the security of the software delivery pipelines themselves, and essentially, kind of looking at the security of the whole software supply chain, if you will. And a lot of this has to do with some of the very high-profile breaches that we've seen recently. Don't want to name any names because I don't like to throw people under the bus, but I think you know what I'm talking about. And so I think we're seeing a very increased focus on not just did we do the right thing, but can we prove that we did the right thing? And especially in regulated industries, especially when there's governance and controls involved, it's no longer enough to just sort of have somebody sign a piece of paper and say, yeah, we did the code scan, or yeah, we did this step that we're supposed to do. We actually want to actively interrogate the pipelines and the metadata around the pipelines to say, okay, we ran the code scan, we used the configuration that we're supposed to use and not some other configuration. We inspected the results and make that part of the chain of evidence that we collect as part of the software delivery pipelines, especially as I said, in regulated industries. So I think that focus is seeing more effort now, more sort of intensity around it. And that is a little bit new because it's really shifting away from not just the application itself, but also everything that sort of surrounds it, which to me makes perfect sense. And I think to most of us probably makes perfect sense. It's a little bit like, if you're in a restaurant, you obviously want to focus on the quality of your ingredients and the quality of the thing that goes on the plate, but the kitchen has to be clean as well, or things aren't going to work out very well. So it's that sort of situation where now we're starting to look at the kitchen as well.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I fully agree, Anders, that it's changing. The practices are changing. Maybe to put things a little bit in a historical perspective, when DevOps just kind of emerged, there was the pressure points that cloud was emerging, Agile was putting on the door, the pressure of production, and the whole idea of we cannot fail changed from assumed failure. So there were like similar threats that kind of emerged. And I always say DevOps at the time was a zeitgeist of different patterns coming together. Even the cultural pattern of society, of people collaborating on the Facebooks, on the social networks, that kind of was less of a top-down structure. So you see this same thing happening. And then with DevSecOps, the move to the cloud required us to rethink how we deal with security. The pressure of doing faster deploys kind of put the pressure on, well, how do we deal with all these controls we have? Like, they're not like sufficient anymore. So we kind of have to rethink that process. The scale, like you mentioned, it's not just about the breach. It was about the scale of the breach that we can have these days with a single thing having millions of people impacted. And that is something that also required new rethinking, because as much as we relied on doing things ourselves in the past, much like DevOps, we build our own data center, we do everything ourselves. The mentality has shifted from having other third parties, people kind of help us. That could have been the cloud, helping us to do a leaner data center, be more flexible on the cost. But it could also be using libraries, using third-party services, and extending that use. And for security, what it changed is that they couldn't control the perimeter anymore. It wasn't just what was inside the walls, what the company dictates, what they could control. So their whole security strategy from build up, like we control the perimeter and what's in and out is what's secure and not secure. That kind of ship has sailed in the cloud perspective with all the collaboration. And I know people talk a lot about the pipeline and the automation, but there's a lot of different pressure points that kind of have built up for security just to change their behavior because the problem changed, the friction point has changed, their strategy needed to change. And that's why I think DevSecOps as a label has been pretty instrumental to get all the stories out into the world there.
So on that, do you think that it created even more tension? So DevOps creates this new world of we're going to be assuming failure, but we're going to build a process that allows us to deal with it quickly, right? And in the end, we'll have a better operational outcome. When you go to that model, one version is security just wasn't along for the ride yet, so they're still living in a different model. The other version is that model actually makes it harder for security as long as they're still assuming no failure. So did it stretch the tension even more, or is it just about getting security into the flow?
Yeah, I think it brought the tension point was there. The scale changed it, the speed changed it, but I think predominantly the businesses became more aware that they needed a solution. Like on the business level, the risk was getting too high, the delivery was delayed, which was now a valuable point from DevOps, that they kind of gained businesses from being more agile, being more flexible, and so yes, it stretched it, but in a good way. Like any bottleneck kind of highlights an issue that's there. And DevOps, the issue has been before DevOps as a term existed. The tension has been there for many years. It wasn't until something other changed that there wasn't attention from the business. As at one quote I remember, there was an article, "Operations is the secret weapon." Right? And then all of the companies said, "Oh, that's the secret weapon. That's how we get customers, and that's how we maintain customers." And the same thing feels a little bit of security. We haven't seen the exact thing yet, but imagine your company survives and the others don't. That will show you that there's a lot of value that we can bring with security as well.
Yeah.
Right.
I think we've seen how much faster and better we can operate with DevOps, and you kind of get addicted to that a little bit because that helps the business. And then traditionally, if you think back on security, a lot of times the way that we got security into the product was to slow things down, right? So that we could inspect them, so that we could test them, and we could add security, which isn't something you can really add, but that's what we thought. And that isn't acceptable anymore, right? Slowing down the process in order to add security isn't acceptable anymore, because then we lose part of what we gained with DevOps and being able to get into production faster and more reliably and those sorts of things. And that's, in a highly competitive environment where every company is a software company, that hurts, that hurts the business. And so there's now much more support, I think, from the business end of things for, hey, figure out how to do this securely, figure out how to do this well. We can't, security breaches like this can be existential, right? And we've seen this in the past where companies, go out of business because, especially if you're a financial company or a trading company, in 2 minutes you lose $400 million when you have a problem due to a bug. That's existential. And so it really is kind of we've seen the light on the hill. And we know that we can get to where we can operate, quickly and efficiently and do things well. And we're not willing anymore to operate slowly just in order to, again, I have to air quote it because it's such a silly notion, but to add security.
Because it's existential either way, right? If you, in a certain industry, if you suffer a bad breach or a bad security incident, it could be the end of you. If you go so slowly that you don't keep up competitively, you're blockbuster and it's the end of you, right? So either way, you've got to solve for both, and that's kind of what DevOps did. When you think about, you made a really good point, Anders, in the beginning, which is we went from trying to secure the product the application, the code, right? To now also, and we had an environment and tools and process to secure the product. And now we're trying to secure the environment, the tools, the application, the process, and the product. Did it come with any new measurements or any new metrics? Like with DevOps, in addition to trying to maintain uptime and performance and quality, there are some metrics about, well, how fast can I get something deployed, right? How fast can an engineer go from A to B? That helped improve the overall process. Have we seen anything like that in security?
I think, from my perspective, the first thing I would probably point to, and I'm sure Patrick will have more interesting insights here, but time to detect and time to remediate are still good metrics and apply to security. Because how quickly can I detect that I'm using a vulnerability or that I have a vulnerability in production? If you go back and look at the Equifax breach and you look at how long it took them to understand that they were vulnerable, and how long it took them to even inform their CISO at the time that they were subject to this vulnerability, that's not something you want to have happen, right? That's not a situation. That's not a happy place to be in. So I think how quickly can we understand from the time that the vulnerability is disclosed to when we understand what its impact is on us? That's one sort of cycle time that I think we want to think about, and then also then time to remediation. If it's just a quick go into my Maven POM file and tweak the patch number on a third-party library, build, test, deploy, put it into production. What's that cycle time? I think those are probably those are some pretty interesting metrics that you want to understand, and you want to know that you have the capability to do that. And I think oftentimes when we talk about the more complex orchestrations that we do and those sorts of things, a lot of that is so that we can get really good at doing the simple things, right? So that when there's just a burning zero-day vulnerability that's just been disclosed and we got to patch this library, that library, that we want to have just a straight, rapid path into production for those simple changes, but that still goes through all the things that we have to go through in order to make sure that we're doing it correctly. So those are the two I would point out. I'm sure Patrick will have a few others to chime in with as well.
Yeah, I think they've been predominant in let's say the first 5 or 6 years of DevOps. That was kind of the detection and the remediation. I think since then, people started seeing that you can only sample so much and so fast. Like there's always a period where you don't see it, where you don't kind of see what's happening.
And it's a frequency of measurement problem in that sense.
And so the narrative kind of shifted. And if people don't know him, John Allspaw is really talking about resilience engineering, and he's not talking about making the systems resilient. He's talking about the resilience as, are we learning from incidents, right? And can we deal with the incident? And that's the focus, that even you will always miss a sample, you will always miss a detection, but imagine then when it happens, are you ready there as well? And sometimes jokingly, I call this like shift right. It's like be prepared for the unknowns, while at the same time shift left, deal with the things early in the value stream. But you kind of need to have both strategy. And that continuous learning could be measured by, are we getting the same incident types over and over again? Can we show this? So it's more of a class of measurement, and it's the direct measurement. You need the other measurements to kind of understand the detection, and you definitely want to get better at this. But for example, the same shift has happened with monitoring. It was all about detection and the sampling side, and then all of a sudden it became observability, which was, we don't know what we're going to hit, but we're going to collect, and then we're going to get better at dealing with the unknowns. So both kind of are expansions on the idea of the detection and the remediation, is be prepared and then learn from that. And that is kind of like the additional spin that we can save security from just looking at the measurement, but immediately jump in like, okay, there needs to be some learning there as well. So
yeah, I love what John Allspaw says. I think it was in one of his tweets about every incident, you've already paid the cost, right? Now the question is, can you learn from it, and can you get better from it? Because it's a sunk cost in terms of the outage or the vulnerability or what have you. And really, it's now, can we collect some benefit from it that we've already paid the price?
Great. So one of the things as we move into this view of starting to get in is we might run into some bottlenecks, and we're going to now go to Charlene, who's going to ask the audience a question here to try to identify where we might see some of these bottlenecks.
Yeah, so the polling question has just been pushed out. The question is, what is your number one bottleneck preventing adoption of DevSecOps methodologies today? The poll should be up on your screen. It's also in the polls tab under the open section. You can make your choice from tools that are overly complicated, no shared security responsibility between security operations and development/DevOps teams, not solving security issues early enough in the application development lifecycle, lack of trust between security and application development teams, or my organization hasn't started to add security into the DevOps fold. So we'll go ahead and leave this polling question open for a little bit. Ravi, I don't know if you guys want to continue your conversation and then we can circle back on the poll results, or if you want to just leave it open for a second and then we'll take a look at the results. You tell me.
I think it'd be great to leave it open for maybe just a couple more seconds, and then we'll look at the results.
Okay, great. Well, while we're doing that, just a quick reminder that if you have a question for any of our speakers, you do not have to wait for the question and answer period. You can go ahead and submit your question at any time, and we'll take as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. All right, we are doing really well with our responses, so I'm going to give folks about 10 more seconds, and then we'll close it out and take a look at the responses. All right, got 5 more seconds here. 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm closing the poll now. Let's take a look at the results. The question was, what is your number one bottleneck preventing adoption of DevSecOps methodologies today? The largest percentage, 45%, folks said no shared security responsibility between security operations and development/DevOps teams, which I think is kind of interesting. The second largest number was 23% who said tools that are overly complicated. So, and then we had 18% who said that their organization hadn't even started to add security. And then 14% said not solving security issues early enough in the application development lifecycle. So I don't know what you guys want to do.
And that was 0%. No one chose lack of trust between security and application development teams, which is interesting because I think that there's a narrative out there that there's a friction between the security and the development people, the teams, versus there's a friction maybe in the goals of the organization, which maybe causes the strain. Interested on your guys' thoughts on that. I know it's the 0% answer, but it jumps out that no one hit it.
Well, I guess if if there's no shared security responsibility, and you haven't started to add security into the DevOps fold, then we've got about 60% right there that there is no opportunity for friction. So there is no opportunity for lack of trust because people aren't talking to each other, people aren't interacting. So they sort of interrelate a little bit. The no shared security responsibility. I sort of interpret that as we have siloed teams to some extent still, and I think one model that I've seen work really well is embedding security people with the product teams, whether it's permanently or whether they bungee in, bungee out, whether it's sort of a dojo kind of approach to, come sit with us, come learn, come see. You don't want the first time that you interact with your security team to be after, during a breach, right? Because that's going to be awkward and weird and stressful. And, I think we would do better in the industry if we interacted more with each other. Embedding is one option. Obviously there's lots of others, and we don't all have enough resources, enough people to be able to sort of permanently put a high level security person in each product team, but or at least most places won't. So that isn't really an option. But to really start to understand what the threat profiles are, what the best practices are, how to do things more easily, how not to get in each other's way, how to be more efficient, and I think too the other, another way to approach that in terms of doing this scalably is, use your orchestration tools, use your automation so that you can have a shared services team or a shared service set up and run and maintain your scans for you, for example, right? And we have lots of financial customers where this is sort of mandated, right? They don't let the product teams determine what scans to run. They just, they have to run them, and here's how you run it against your stuff, right? And they sort of provide a shared library approach, if you will, to doing that. So that's another, that works fairly well for them in terms of that scales well. They can make changes to it that then automatically apply to all the product teams, those sorts of things. But get to know your security folks. Don't get to know them at 2 a.m. when there's a breach, because that won't be fun.
I think that's good. Actually, coming into Patrick here, maybe jumping off of that question too, as we look to try to create this shared responsibility. One of the things we can do is look at, well, where did it work in DevOps, right? So from your experience, and we'll go to both. I'll start with Patrick. What have we learned from DevOps that organizations can apply to DevSecOps or getting security in, and maybe even especially as it relates to this challenge of how do we get the teams to work together and create this shared ownership, the way DevOps created with Ops and Dev?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. I'm hearing a bit of a echo, but people have debated that DevOps is a job role where somebody who does both development and operations at the same time, and this has been this almost like ultimate job description, the person who takes care, almost like the full stack engineer who kind of knows everything, right? And let's throw now security in the mix, right? Why not? Like some more cognitive load on the developers, they kind of have to know everything. What I see is that there's been different topologies. There's been people kind of getting a group of everybody does everything. There's been some half overlapping. They kind of collaborate between, sometimes maybe through the pipeline, sometimes maybe through some kind of more reviewing process. And then there's we do everything kind of ourselves with our small team. I think the crux is that you look at DevOps or people, their tasks, not anymore as their roles, right? Sorry, not anymore as their group title, but one person can do multiple roles. And a developer, for example, a traditional developer can do 20% of the operations through automation and can take, or maybe 80%, but he still needs that speciality of 20% where he goes to another kind of more expert. What always helps is if somebody has an understanding of the other task, they almost have the empathy or kind of understand the problem space. They might not have the solution, but they kind of understand the problem space. It was no surprise, actually, that from the early DevOps advocates, there were somewhere between the 35 and the 40 years old, which was basically they kind of had the experience. They went through some of the roles. They kind of felt the pain. And that kind of shared buildup of experience and knowledge existed. It's a fallacy to think like we will put everybody together and everybody does the same thing. I think it's a little bit called, there's a term for that, is the tragedy of the commons, where you say like, okay, here's the shared land, do whatever you want. And there's no clear rules. It can end well if everybody's polite. It can end horribly, like one overtaking the other. And that's kind of the buildup of, do we trust the other person to do the right thing? Like if they're not going to take things away or they're going to do wrong, and that's part of that buildup of the team. So they might not see it as trust building, and that's why maybe they answered like 0%. But there's no problem. Theoretically, there's no problem of having a separate development team, a separate operations team, and them collaborating. Yeah, this is perfect as long as they kind of say, well, we trust you to do the right thing. It's your expertise, and you're always there for us if we need you. And you don't necessarily have to kind of all the skills, but it obviously helps kind of if there's some overlap in skill, some understanding, to form that shared understanding. But it's a fallacy to think, let's just put everybody together in a room and self-organizing and we're done. Like it's just not going to happen. And that's why the introduction of, like Anders mentioned, a security champion or kind of advocate, bring that into a team, is kind of evangelize this pain. Does that mean the whole team needs to do this? Right? We're not saying the whole team needs to do UX. The whole team needs to do front end. So it's very similar. We kind of have to know enough and to know when we need to ask for help. And that is actually the most important thing. Like, ask for help and don't necessarily kind of solve all your problems yourself. And then it depends how the other kind of react. Do they actually care about your problem or not? And that's a whole other discussion of the buildup of trust there in a moment. And it's no different in DevOps as it is in DevSecOps. It's just human relationships. You're in, you're out. Well, we need like an intermediate. We kind of need to have like a shared pain, a shared goal. And it's not rocket science. Like, my kids know this at school, but yeah, it doesn't mean it's easy to implement.
Yeah, most of the things that we needed to learn to function well together, we learned in kindergarten. It's just a question of whether we apply them properly. And I think too, there is that sort of notion that if we have a team that we add the label DevOps to, or we have engineers that we add the label DevOps to, that all of a sudden we're doing DevOps. And that's sort of a cargo cult mentality, I think. And I've had companies that I've worked with where, you ask them a question like, well, so are you doing DevOps? Are you thinking about it? Like, oh yeah, we have a team that does that. Okay, you have a team that does that. Like that sort of misses the point of the whole experience. But everybody wants to do it, so that's kind of good. At least they know what the term is. I think it's the trust and the human interaction is so important, because that, and I think that I just want to kind of emphasize what Patrick said there about asking for help. That's so important to be in a culture, to be in an organization where I don't quite know how to do this, or I don't know what that means, and feel comfortable to sort of raise your hand. And especially these days when you have to raise it remotely, you're not, you can't just sort of whisper to the person sitting next to you, hey, do you know what this means? Because you have to actually, very proactively raise your hand these days. That's very important. And I think great point too about sort of, most of the people that started agitating for DevOps, and probably for Agile too, if we go back and look at that, were people that had been in the business for 15, 20 years, had seen enough to sort of see the patterns, right? And see the good patterns, the bad patterns. And at the same time, then you also, just to close the loop a little bit on the whole idea of the full stack engineer, which to me is a unicorn. They exist sort of, but they burn out very quickly because they get all the responsibility for everything labeled on top of them. And I have much of a preference for full stack teams, whether that's permanently attached security people, permanently attached user experience people, or whether it's, sort of people flit in, people flit out, you form and reform teams, those sorts of things. And just understand that, you have to work with someone for a while before you understand them, before you understand what they do, what's important to them, how that works. And then once you gain that understanding, you're much more effective the next time yourself in how to work with that function within your company. So if you worked a little bit with a security person, you worked a little bit with a designer or a user experience person or an architect or a DBA. DBAs are another one of those sort of functions that are still kind of a little bit, off siloed in their own world, not as much as they used to be. But you start to accumulate a little bit of that experience and a little bit of that being able to see their point of view. And I think that's very important in security, because you need to understand what the threat profile is. You need to understand what the important parts are to worry about in the part that you play. So that, the more you can mix people up like that, the better the soup becomes. And
is there a lesson that we learned in DevOps on how to do that? So there was it sounds like the key point is we may need to have people who are specialists enough in something that they can do it really well. So our goal isn't to hire people the unicorns that can do everything equally and just staff our team with that. Our goal is to get to a level of empathy. You need to understand the other person's job well enough to be able to work with them in this new mode, even if you can't do it all the way. What is there anything we learned from DevOps when we tried to do that with Dev and Ops? So in some cases, you know, in the early days, you found people who did know both and had, you know, empathy from experience. Did we learn anything in terms of creating empathy that we could then apply to security?
Yeah, I think similar patterns from I've seen people rotate their roles, so not within the silo. So today you're responsible for the tickets, and the next day somebody else. There is obviously a danger because, again, tragedy of the commons, like, well, the problem is for the next person, right? But if you then mix in like, okay, let's forget this. We're going to try with the whole team to get this list of issues as minimal as possible. Then what all of a sudden happens is you start having the conversation, which you should have had, around like, okay, how do we deal with this? And then, like we said, having the empathy and the understanding, it's the diversity of opinions of multiple views. And that's why, Agile went to pair programming. We're now heading into kind of mob programming. We're all kind of making these decisions together. Quite similar to how we're reviewing code. We're all on the chat. We all can ventilate our stuff, and we can get a much stronger feedback loop on that. So that are some examples of do this in pairs, work together, don't do things solo, get the review, the feedback, be a good contributor to give feedback from you as well, and not write like commit it as your commit message. Like it's not really helpful. So there's a couple of these hygiene roles that really help you set part of improve the conversation. I think there's role play people have done, game days, which is also a similar way of understanding the pains if you all of a sudden find yourself in a different role. The true kind of alignment is usually when you start understanding who does what on a team. Like, what's your preference? And always align a preference with what a person likes to do, because the motivation is really helpful in that stuff. Like, I've been on many teams and they say, you're the DevOps person. I don't mind. They call me a DevOps person. I'm not going to bother them with a discussion, but okay, I'll take care of this if you take care of that, and I trust you to do that right thing. And that balance, I haven't found another efficient way. The balance only gets created by chatting and discussing issues. In DevOps, another key tool we used was the value stream mapping. We kind of discussed how the whole chain worked. Who decides what? Then it's handoff to that person. And that creates, besides a nice visual everybody likes, right? But it creates the shared understanding of the system. What are we really facing? And that's something that really helps in their understanding. I had a company for 5 years. At the last 2 weeks, we had to write the documentation, and we finally sat together, did the more programming, and we never learned as much as from each other by just sitting together. We worked like 5 years together. Like, we thought, like, we know the company, like the whole system in and out. But that conversation is key there.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, whether it's the beginning of DevOps or the beginning of an organization starting down the DevOps journey, it's a little bit like that movie, and I forget the name of the movie, but two warring aliens, their planes crash on one planet. And in order to survive, they have to get to know each other and get to trust each other. They don't speak the same language, right? And that's a little bit what we were faced with, obviously over dramatizing it clearly. But we didn't speak each other's languages. And you can say, that can be Dev and Ops, it can be Dev and QA, it can be product management and QA. I mean, any sort of organization. And the only way that we're able to survive in that environment is to start to talk to each other and to communicate and to understand the value that each one of us brings to the table and the function that we serve. And if you're thinking to yourself every time you interact with a security team person that, oh, all they ever care about is to point out little niggly things about, this and that, and, you shouldn't store passwords there, and you shouldn't do that, and you should upgrade that library. And, all they ever care about is nitpicky things. It's like, okay, put yourself in their shoes, and start to understand a little bit. And then, vice versa on the security side, think about the engineer with their massive backlog of things that they have to get to and the technical depth that they're trying to drill their way through and all of those sorts of things. And, one of the most effective things I've ever seen for engineers to understand how their customers use the products is to work in the field. Go work with the professional services people. Go sit with a support person taking calls or processing tickets from customers, and you will get empathy instantaneously. Right. I mean, it will be injected into your arm instantaneously, right? Of just understanding how, if that error message doesn't include a clue as to what the problem is, or if the logs don't have information about what just happened, or depending on the sort of situation that you're in, you're in a snowstorm. You're in a total whiteout. You have no clue what to do next, and that starts to build understanding and empathy of, okay, so I have to build my product. I have to write my code so that, logging, for example, I don't scare the crap out of people by logging every little thing with a bunch of exclamation points at the end of it. And at the same time, I don't, drop the important information that should be in there to give them a clue as to what the problem is. So that building of empathy by crossing the borders and having the cultures interact a little bit is there's no substitute for it. It's a requirement, I think, in my book.
I'd like to add to that is that quite often people come to me and they said, like, we tried everything. We tried talking to all these people, right? And they just don't get it. And then I usually rephrase it like, do you actually know what problem they're trying to solve? Are you listening what they're trying to overcome as a friction point? Instead of like you saying, we need to do DevOps, we need to do AI. Like, nobody's going to listen. If there's one thing I learned from children, it's like that approach does not compute. Like, you just need to ask, like, okay, how can I help you? What is your problem? And don't mention even DevOps or DevSecOps. Just try to understand how you can help that person, and that is more rewardful and allows you not to get lost in, I'm listening, but it's not really that is the case. So,
all right. Well, it sounds like there's some good opportunities the answer is in working together where you can, right? So you can't throw everybody with all skills into all roles, but that idea of we all did the documentation together, so we had a goal that required us to go together, whether it's role playing or role days where you're doing it even in a model way, or whether it's sending engineers out into the field where you're not the primary, but you are responsible for it, so you're seeing it live. It seems like they're all kind of on that same theme of get them to experience it in some way to a level that makes sense, which is interesting there. Just wanted to go to another poll question, which comes into as we get into the skills required to do some of this.
Yeah, so the second polling question is going out now. You should be on your screen or coming up very, very shortly. The question is, what are the necessary skills for architecting secure software as it is being written? You can choose from learn how to use new tooling, efficiently cooperate and communicate with all stakeholders, create and implement processes that nurture shared responsibility for security, or all of the above. So I'm assuming, Robbie, that as with the last polling question, you want me to just leave this up for a minute or two and let folks go ahead and make their selection, and then we'll take a look at the responses.
That's great. And yeah, maybe for folks who haven't responded yet, I would say maybe answer it as, what do you think is the most important? Because they're all important, and obviously D would then win, right? But what is the most important within those? And if you really believe they're equally important, then select all of the above. While people are answering, there was one other point that I wanted to ask, and I know, Anders, you had some thoughts around this, which was around, so we've learned some things we can do because of what's worked well in DevOps, but are there any lessons in DevOps where we still don't even do it well in DevOps, but we know what the problem is in we could jump ahead and solve it for security at the same time?
Oh gosh, I think we still. It's funny, because I think when we do these webinars, when we talk to each other, we go to conferences, hopefully sometime soon, and when we live in that sort of DevOps bubble, I think one of the things that we assume is, well, everybody knows what to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's all there. We wrote the books, well, I didn't, but the books have been written, the papers have been written, the conferences have been made, all of those things. It's like, just go do it. And I think it's not that simple. This is human interaction. This is organizations. This is culture. This is, and then, on top of that, it's computers and it's systems and it's complex systems and it's, and it's existing legacy products that need to be re-architected or remolded and all the while you've got incoming, security problems and vulnerabilities and technical debt, and it can be overwhelming, right? And I think that's why by far the most frequent question that I get sort of at the end of a talk, almost no matter what the topic is where do I start? Mm-hmm. Right. That is almost always the first and the most frequent question. And I think in the industry, I think we need to have a little bit more of an understanding and empathy for the rest of the world, the rest of the folks out there, that it's very difficult to get started on this. It's very intimidating, and it can seem, and it is very overwhelming if you feel like you have to boil the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that question comes up a lot, which is where do we start? So I think the things like the DevOps handbook, and there's lots of good places to go look for advice on how to do a lot of these things. But I think we also have to understand. And here I'm sort of referring to kind of the people that are kind of thought leaders and so on. Is it's not straightforward to figure out what to do next or what to do first. Which problem is the most important problem? Which is the one that's going to take us down? Which is the one that's going to really hose us in the market because we didn't do something correctly, or we don't cycle fast enough to improve it quickly enough to be competitive, and those sorts of things. And I think we just need to understand that there are companies out there that aren't doing continuous integration yet, much less continuous delivery or continuous testing or sort of DevOps, at high volumes and high scale. There's a wide variety of, and I hate to use the word because I hate it, but it's kind of the best one out there right now, wide levels of maturity in terms of how far people are along that journey. And we got to understand that, and I think when you read the state of DevOps report and you're like, oh, the high performers are 10 million% better than the low performers. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. There are people out there who know how to do these things, no question. But the bulk of us are still not very good at doing this, right? And I think we just have to keep repeating that message, keep working with people, have empathy for people that are trying to do this, right? And understand that is a very intimidating wall to walk up to and be like, all right, I got to climb this thing. Where's the line? Where are the toe holds? Where's my belay partner? All of those sorts of things. And that's something I think we need to work on in the industry itself. Because I know when we talk about this internally in all the companies and so on, where we're sort of the pick and shovel vendors on the gold rush here. We need to have more empathy for how difficult it is to do these tasks as well. So I think we need to reflect inside of ourselves a little bit as well in the organizations.
I think that's really interesting. Charlene, I'll just summarize the scores because I can see them here. And I think it's a pretty straightforward thing. It aligns to what you just said, Anders, which is, so the number one choice was all of the above, but that there was an equal split for second on the effectively cooperate and communicate and create and implement processes. So tooling got 0 votes, right? It was really, everything was about how do we get the people working together? Because you can interpret both of those answers as, one, how do we get them to communicate together? One, how do we get them to have this shared culture of ownership? It was really about the relationships more than the tools and the technology that people jumped into, which was interesting. So just on the last question, I know we're kind of short on time, and we also want to leave some room for Q&A. So maybe a key point from each of you. And Anders, you kind of set me up with this a little bit with your point about the variance in maturity across different teams. But when we think about this goal of shared ownership, from what you've seen in general, how are we making progress? And how does a company know when they're making progress? Is it just you feel like it, or is there some observability that you can have into the way you work, or something else about your business that lets you know that you're further along and you're making progress?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to, kind of measuring progress, metrics, those sorts of things, it's, very important, I think, in terms of outcomes. What are the outcomes that we want to have? What are the outcomes that we want to avoid? We want to, obviously we want to avoid security breaches. We want to avoid quality problems, and security is an aspect of quality, right? There's no question about that, I don't think. So it becomes it's a measurement problem. What is the frequency and the depth at which we can measure? And I think what we traditionally used to do is at the tail end of the process, we would do all the measuring, right? And if you go back to pre-Agile or waterfall, which it's still out there, people are still doing waterfall development, lots of it. The goal was we get to the end of the process and we do all the measuring and all of the depth of measuring that we're going to do. So we do all the quality checks, we do all the security checks, we do all the performance checks, we do all the scalability checks, all of those sorts of things right at the tail end, which of course is when we're least equipped to actually fix a problem, right? And we're most under pressure to get something out, put it in production and release it. And so we learned through Agile that it works a lot better if we iterate. We learned through Agile that it works a lot better if we put something in front of a customer, put something in front of a user, get feedback, make it better, cycle back and forth. And then we learn, of course, that cycle times matter, because if we have very long cycle times, we don't get to do that very often. And security is kind of the same. It's one of those things where if you start to measure the security of your application as if that were just a number that you could assign to an application, which is a fallacy in and of itself. But if you go through that process, you want to do that early. You want to do that often, and you want to pay attention to the feedback that you're getting from that, so that you can, you remediate, so that you don't have to shift right. As Patrick said before, like when you have a vulnerability, when you have an incident, it's student body right. Everybody to the right. Now fix this, lock it down, shut it down. And there's panic, and everybody's running around like chickens with their heads cut off. You don't want to be in that situation, and the only way not to be in that situation is to start on the left and iterate, and learn the things that work for you. If you're deploying into the cloud and you're using containers, then container scanning, configuration scanning, all of those things. And we've learned, and I think this is a good thing, that having snowflake environments is bad, right? Because we can't reproduce them. We can't, when we just continue to fix them until they're this beat up bondoed old jalopy that it still runs and gets us from point A to B, but gosh, that's not the way to do it. At the same time, if we're continually rebuilding our infrastructure every time, we got to make sure we get it right, because we're going to do it a lot. And if we're building our infrastructure manually that way, that's terrible, right? And there are still organizations, large, very large software companies out there, large software companies that you have heard of, that still do, that you work with every day, that still do manual deployments where they have spreadsheets of 700 rows where it's Bob does this, Alice does this, and that's how they do deployments still. So then try to do security on top of that. It's kind of mayhem, right? So it's really about get good at the things that you can automate, get them out of the way, right? So just so that you can focus on the things that you need to apply your brain to, right? Get the repetitive tasks out of the way as much as possible, and really just learn what works for you, learn how you avoid the outcomes. And I think, and Patrick said it before, and I think it's one of the most important lessons is don't make the same mistake twice. That's probably one of the biggest outcomes that you want to avoid, is to make the same mistake twice. So look for that, right? And if you had something happen, if you had an incident, you learned from it, and then it happens again, you didn't learn from it, or what you learned wasn't the right thing. So it's always about, don't repeat the same mistake twice. as much as possible. That's probably the one thing that you want to look for the most.
In your goal. What about you, Patrick? What do you think is a way to know that you're making progress towards the goal of shared ownership?
It's interesting how all these metrics always come up, and I have all the stories to counter all this metrics. Like, is it always bad not to deploy or do things manually? No. Like, I had situations where it wasn't cost efficient to automate that part, and it made sense to do it manual. So it is always putting things in perspective. And the big advice is that, like, work on your biggest bottleneck, try a small thing that helps that biggest bottleneck, and then reevaluate whether that is still your biggest bottleneck. So then don't get stuck in dogmas like, we need to have 10 deploys a day, or we need to have all this automation, or we kind of do things. That's the funny thing about all the metrics. If measuring the metrics becomes the goal, it will get gamed. So don't worry about it. So you can only see them as intermediate kind of measurement of the goal that you're looking for to improve. So that is kind of the direction of this. And I sometimes say, the whole deployment pipeline sometimes is a little bit of a vanity metric in a way that we're doing the deploys, we're getting all this going, but it is building up our confidence. But if it fails, right, do we know the right thing to do? Imagine, I always let them tell you, do the thought experiment. Your pipeline is not working. Do you think your people will do the right secure thing? No. And if you reach that, then it's like much more valuable than when you say my metric is measuring, like, are we doing the deploys today? Maybe today was a holiday, right? But we're not doing deploys. Like, I've seen these monitoring systems for social networks where they monitor the uptime, and all of a sudden it plummets, and everybody was watching a soccer match, right? So all these kind of metrics don't always make sense. It's the interpretation, but that is probably the socio-technical measurement, like how the humans interact and kind of get that security going. And I get your point, Anders. Getting bootstrapped, I would also look for the deployments today and kind of the bottlenecks. And it's kind of where I got some insight of the DevOps report this year. And you see kind of the high performance, they do like the tools and the culture. The low performance, they kind of like are somewhere not doing it. But then the middle, they're not decided. Like, they're like staying, they're doing the walk, but actually not kind of getting results. And it frustrates them. But I think they're not reevaluating their actual bottleneck. They're still stuck in the previous bottleneck about deployment there.
I think that the value stream mapping is very important, because otherwise you don't really know whether you're solving a local minima or a global minima when you're making an improvement. And I worked with one organization once where they were very proud of the fact that they had gotten their build times down dramatically, right? And used one of our products to do it. And then they did 6 weeks of manual testing. So, so you got your 20-hour build down to 2 hours. Awesome. Glad to help you with that. And then you got 6 weeks of manual testing. So, it's one of those things where the local maxima, local minima are it's really important to have a big picture view of where you should make your next improvement, so that you're moving the needle. Because otherwise you may be putting a lot of effort into something that doesn't move the needle.
Yeah, and on that bottleneck,
not having the one goal as dogma, but saying that this is going to be a moving target. Let's understand where we are. Let's observe. But based on that, we may choose something different to focus on next. And there is no. I'm sure there's people on the line here that have questions queued up that say, "Hey, what should I measure? What should I measure?" And the answer is, unfortunately, it's not that simple, because what I tell you to measure first may change over time, and it really depends on your.
It better change over time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Charlene, I know we're down to about 1 minute. I don't know if we have time for a question, or if there's a closing comment that would take up that time.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have time for question and answer period, but everybody who did submit questions, please know that we are going to be, everybody who's on this webinar will be getting a copy of all the questions that came in. And I'm sure that they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. So please know that you will still get your answer. Real quick, just a reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. And real quick, before we close things out, I have 4 $25 Amazon gift card winners I want to let you know about. We have Lawrence V, Chris L, Sasha S, and Andy D. So we'll be following up with all 4 of you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. Patrick, Robbie, Anders, what a great presentation. I just, so much great information. I know the audience got a lot out of it too. So thank you. Thank you for your time and your expertise today. Really do appreciate it. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today, and I'm sorry that we're kind of cutting this short, but this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.